In a small coastal town, where the sound of the waves and the scent of salt create a relaxing atmosphere, lived Beatriz, a simple and hard-working woman. She was usually seen dressed in cotton clothing in neutral tones, often with a t-shirt and shorts, reflecting her connection to village life and her role as a mother and wife. Her brown eyes shone with a glint of determination, while her straight hair fell over her shoulders, sometimes disheveled by the sea wind. Beatriz was a generous soul, known for her warmth and her ability to help others. Her husband, Fernando, was a robust and healthy fisherman with long yellow hair and a mustache and beard that often showed his character. His skin was tanned by the sun and his hands showed evidence of years of hard work at sea. Fernando usually wore a tank top and work pants, always stained with fish and sand. He was a man of few words, but his presence was imposing. Each morning, he would head out into the ocean waters in his small boat, hoping to bring home a good day's catch. Fernando's past was marked by tragedy. For months, he had been dealing with the loss of his sister Patricia, who had died in a mysterious accident. Patricia was a wealthy and elegant woman, known in the community for her arrogance and opulent lifestyle. Her blonde hair and perfectly cared-for skin were the result of a lifestyle that many envied. She always wore clothes from prestigious designers, with sparkling jewelry that accentuated her status, making her the center of attention at any event. However, her haughtiness and disdain for the working class aroused both admiration and disdain. Beatriz, in particular, had felt a deep resentment toward Patricia, not only for her superior attitude, but also for how she had always treated Fernando. She clearly remembered the last time Patricia had been at home, mocking her brother's life and criticizing the effort he put into fishing. "Life isn't just about catching fish, Fernando. You need to think of something bigger," she had told him one day, with a sneer. That was just one of many occasions when Patricia had belittled her brother's and Beatriz's lives. The tension between the siblings often manifested itself in sporadic encounters, but they always escalated into arguments. Even though Patricia was not in Fernando and Beatriz's lives, her shadow continued to influence their days, creating a tense atmosphere at home. However, Patricia's death had left Fernando devastated. Despite their differences, he felt that he had lost an important part of himself. Beatriz, although she had felt relief at Patricia's absence, realized that her husband's sadness affected her, and she had tried to be her support. One morning, Fernando woke up to the sun shining through the window. He turned around and saw Beatriz still asleep. Despite the difficulties in his marriage, there was something about the daily routine that brought him comfort. He decided to take advantage of the nice weather and proposed to Beatriz to go fishing with him. Although she had never been a big fan of fishing, she accepted, excited to spend time alone with her husband. They arrived at the port in their car, breathing in the fresh sea air. The sea breeze felt invigorating, and Beatriz smiled as she watched Fernando prepare the boat. Meanwhile, she remembered the days gone by, when she couldn't help but feel jealous of Patricia. That morning, while they were at sea, she decided it was the perfect time to talk to Fernando about how she really felt about her sister-in-law. With the boat underway, the tranquility of the ocean enveloped them. The waves gently crashed against the boat as they headed toward their fishing spots, far from the coast. Fernando was focused on sailing, while Beatriz looked at him contemplatively. The connection between them had always been strong, but the silences seemed deeper in Patricia's absence. Beatriz, feeling the need to open up, said to Fernando, "I'm sorry we haven't talked about what happened with Patricia. I know her death affects you, but—" Fernando interrupted her, bowing his head as he held the helm. "Beatriz, I don't want to remember those moments. It's okay, let's keep fishing." However, Beatriz could not contain herself any longer. "Fernando, I can't help but feel that her death is a form of justice. She never treated us with respect, and what happened to her? Fate is curious." With those words, the silence of the sea grew denser. Fernando looked at her with surprise and dismay, but deep down, there was also a spark of agreement, a small relief in his sadness. Towards noon, with the sun shining brightly overhead, they began fishing. A sense of anticipation filled the air as Beatriz struggled to catch her first fish. With each movement of the rod, her mind wandered, remembering Patricia's arrogance and how she had always looked down on her simple life in the village. As they retrieved their equipment at the end of the day, Beatriz's heart beat faster and her mind filled with confusing thoughts about her sister-in-law. Patricia had been a constant torment, but even in her absence, she could still feel the echo of her words. In a moment of relief, between nervous laughs, Beatriz turned her head and said to Fernando, "You know, sometimes I think that if I had her money, maybe I would live happier. Fernando gave her a serious look. That's not the answer. Money doesn't bring happiness like she thought. She was arrogant, and it cost her everything. Beatrice felt that was an important point, but deep inside, a part of her longed for Patricia's life, even though she would never admit it. As they prepared the boat to return home, she began to remember the day of her sister-in-law's death. You know, Fernando? I never knew what really happened that day. Who was the last person to see her? Fernando shrugged, letting out a deep sigh. I have no idea. She was always alone, surrounded by her own world. Upon returning home, Beatrice couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. Fishing might have been considered a good day, but the memory of Patricia, the arrogance of her life, and her tragic end weighed heavily on her mind. When they finally arrived home, they sat on the porch, watching the stars appear in the night sky, filled with silence and reflection. Thus began the story of a love in crisis, a hidden secret, and a tragic outcome that would leave an indelible mark on their lives. Beatrice sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking on the tablecloth. Fernando came in and noticed the tension in the air. The afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen, filling the space with a somber atmosphere. Beatrice knew the time had come to talk. This secret had consumed her, and it was time to release the burden she carried in her heart. Fernando, there's something I need to tell you. Something important about Patricia's death, she began, her voice breaking with anxiety. Fernando stopped dead in his tracks, his expression changing from confusion to disbelief. What do you mean? Why are you talking about her now? We don't want to remember that night. I know, but I need you to listen, Beatrice continued, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't an accident. I was involved, in a terrible way. What? How can you say that? Fernando replied, his voice high and shaky. Beatrice clenched her fists, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. I'm telling you, I killed her. It was me. The words echoed in the room, and a heavy silence settled between them. Fernando seemed unable to process what he had just heard. That's not possible. Why didn't you tell me before? What do you mean you killed her? Taking a deep breath, Beatrice decided to open up completely. It all started that night at the party. We were on the beach. You were talking to some friends and Patricia and I were left alone. She always put me down, Fernando. She always found a way to make me feel inferior. That night, her words hurt me more than ever. Beatrice remembered the scene clearly. Patricia had been drinking, and her dismissive attitude intensified. You're just my brother's wife. You'll never be part of this family, she had shouted at her. Beatrice felt rage bubbling up inside her. Every hurt Patricia had inflicted on her over the years bubbled to the surface, along with a crushing despair. She felt like she couldn't take it anymore. As the argument escalated, I took her to a secluded place, away from the music and the people. I wanted her to listen to me, to understand what her arrogance made me feel. I shouted at her that I was tired of her treatment, of her constant contempt. But as she spoke, I couldn't contain my anger. She laughed, as if everything I said didn't matter to her at all, Beatrice recalled, her voice increasingly breaking. So, in a moment of rage, I pushed her. I didn't think about the consequences. I wanted her to stop, to see reason, but I lost control. I pushed her harder than I intended, and she fell into the water. I saw her scream and struggle to get out, but I didn't do anything. I just watched her. I wanted her to understand what it felt like to be in that position. Fernando paled, visibly shocked by the brutality of her words. Didn't you try to save her? Didn't you do anything? I understand. It was a moment of madness, Beatrice said, tears streaming down her cheeks. I was paralyzed. The truth is, deep down, a part of me wanted her to suffer. I wanted her to pay for what she had done to me. I saw her struggle and scream, and something broke inside me. I heard her voice, but my feelings of revenge and hatred were stronger. I don't know how many seconds passed. It all felt like an eternity. Fernando stared at her, anger and pain reflected on his face. You are responsible for his death. Beatrice, why didn't you tell me before? Why bear this alone? Because I was afraid, Fernando. Afraid of losing you. I knew that if I told you the truth, you would never forgive me. I thought that if I could live with this, I could protect you from the pain, Beatrice explained, her voice hoarse from crying. And you thought that was the best thing? This is your way of protecting me." Fernando stood up from the table, unable to remain seated. "She was my sister, the woman I almost considered a friend, despite her arrogance. How can you tell me that and expect me to accept it?" Beatriz felt as if everything was falling apart around her. "You don't understand. Sometimes anger can consume us, Fernando. I couldn't think clearly. I let myself be carried away by the pain that had made me suffer for years, and in that instant, everything went wrong." Fernando was furious, but behind his anger was pain and confusion. "And what were you planning to do now? How are we going to live with this? This can't be ignored. You can't go back and change what you did." "I know I can't change it, Fernando, but I have to take responsibility. I want the world to know what really happened. I need justice, whatever the cost," Beatriz said, feeling her heart breaking. "Justice? How can you seek justice when this is your truth? You have destroyed my life, Beatriz." Fernando cried, his eyes filled with tears. "If you really feel something, you should turn yourself in. But I know that could mean you are gone from my life forever." "I feel the same way, Fernando. Every day feels like a prison, and even though it hurts, I know I can't go on like this. I struggle between fear and the need to release this secret. My heart is heavy with guilt," Beatriz confessed, feeling that each word was wearing her down. Stopping, Fernando realized that his world had been rocked by the betrayal of the one he loved. "I don't know if I can forgive you. It will take time before I can process all of this." Beatriz nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I just need you to understand that I didn't mean to. Our lives have come together in such a complex and tortuous way, and now I have caused irreparable pain. I am willing to face the consequences, but I also want you to understand the circumstances." Fernando sat back down, his expression softening a little. "I'm so hurt by what you've done. I don't know if I can imagine a future without Patricia. And now, seeing that you had something to do with it. It's like being caught between two worlds full of suffering. Fernando, I am so sorry. I could never have predicted that my actions would have such a tragic ending. I have no excuses. I just hope that, in time, you can decide what you want to do with this," Beatriz said, her voice breaking. The two of them fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Fernando felt as if he were in the middle of an emotional turmoil, struggling between his love for Beatriz and the pain of losing his sister. "Beatriz, if you decide to give yourself up, I don't know if I can keep up with you. But if you choose to stay here, I'd like to move on somehow," he said finally, the conflict on his face overwhelming him. Beatriz knew she had to make a decision, and although it hurt, she understood that it was the only possible way. "I will have to do it, for myself and for Patricia's memory. I want to face the consequences and accept what I have done. I cannot continue hiding it." Night fell heavily on the coastal town, plunging everything into a deep gloom. The waves broke rhythmically against the shore, as if the ocean itself had its own pulse, indifferent to human conflict. Fernando, caught in an emotional storm, boarded his ship with Beatriz following him. Rage and pain at the revelation of his betrayal consumed him, and his mind could not find peace. They both boarded the boat in silence, the engine roaring as Fernando started it. The lights of the city were fading as they moved away from the shore, and Beatriz could feel the tension in the air, weighing on her like an oppressive burden. She looked at Fernando, trying to read his expression, but was met with a blank stare, filled with a pain they had both shared, but which was now becoming a reason for fury. "Where are you taking me?" Beatriz asked, her voice shaking. But Fernando remained silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The pain he felt over Patricia's death had been intensified by Beatriz's revelation, a devastating discovery that seemed to have shattered his world. His sister, whom he had loved unconditionally, had been the victim of an act of betrayal, and now Beatriz, the woman who swore eternal love to him, seemed to be responsible. As they sailed out to sea, the sea became a reflection of the chaos inside Fernando. In his mind, he remembered Patricia and all the plans they had shared, every laugh and every dream that now felt empty and far away. The relationship with Beatriz had started as a refuge of love and warmth, but it had transformed into an emotional battlefield where, at least for Fernando, there was no way out. "Please, Fernando, let's talk about this. We need to understand each other," Beatriz insisted, feeling desperation take hold of her. She knew she had made an irreparable mistake, but the weight of her guilt was mixed with the fear of her husband's reaction. The sound of the boat's engine and the smell of salt from the sea filled the air instead of silencing her anguish. Understand? How can you possibly understand that you lied to me? How can you demand something like that after what you did? Fernando roared, letting out all of his pent-up anger. His voice echoed in the darkness, cutting through the air and leaving Beatriz momentarily stunned. The flash of Fernando's inner storm frightened her, and every word he spoke seemed to tear at her heart. Fernando, I didn't want this to happen. I didn't think I'd ever be able to face this, but I've carried this secret for so long. I didn't know how to tell you, Beatriz explained, her voice breaking as she tried to appeal to the part of him that had once been understanding. You didn't know, but you ruined my life. I had to bury my sister and now I have to deal with this because you couldn't face the truth. Every word that came out of his mouth brought her closer to the abyss, pushing her to a place where neither reason nor compassion could save her. Beatriz felt a chill run through her. Fernando's anger was unrelenting, and although she understood that his pain was justifiable, she could not allow that rage to overflow in a violent way. Fernando, I am not your enemy, she said, trying to remain calm. But inside her, terror was beginning to grow. Fernando took the helm with shaking hands, guiding the boat into deeper waters. You know what? Sometimes I think the real enemy is you. You've destroyed everything I had, and now I have to face this alone. I really can't be here with you anymore. His tone became increasingly aggressive, and he let out a gasp that echoed through the night. Please, just listen to me. I'm suffering too. I didn't know that what I did would have such a terrible consequence, Beatriz said, feeling despair engulf her. But every time Fernando looked at her, his resentment became more evident. It was clear that his personal pain had eclipsed any possibility of empathy. At that moment, the sea seemed to reflect the tension between them. The waves began to churn, creating a frenetic rhythm that embodied the emotional struggle taking place in Fernando's heart. Anger, pain, and confusion mixed together in a whirlwind that threatened to swallow them both. Beatriz felt fear wash over her as drops of salt water splashed her face. What do you want from me, Beatriz? Do you want me to forgive you? To forget all this, he cried. The bitterness in his voice rang with devastating intensity, as if every word was designed to make her feel as small and broken as he felt. I can't look you in the eyes without remembering what you did. Beatriz, feeling all control slipping away from her, crashed into the edge of the boat, her tears mixing with the water around her. Fernando, please. For our history, for what we've shared. I need you to understand that I'm here. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this, she pleaded, her voice breaking with tears. But the storm inside Fernando continued to grow, and he could no longer discern between the love he had felt and the rage that had consumed him. He approached her and, in a moment of blind fury, he lunged at her, pushing her against the ship's railing. I can't go on like this. I can't keep feeling this. Beatriz's eyes filled with terror. Fernando, no. Please. You're not a monster. She tried to pull away, but he held her tightly, his eyes full of madness. The sea roared around them, as if it were witnessing everything, the screams and despair mixing in a symphony of horror. At that moment, Fernando felt his anger reach its peak. I hate you for what you did. I hate you, he screamed, his voice heartbreaking and filled with a sadness he didn't know how to handle. Reflecting on everything he had lost, the image of his sister floated into his mind, reminding him of the suffering Patricia had gone through before she died. What would you do if you were in my place? Would you believe in redemption after what you did? In a fit of rage, Fernando pushed her into the water. Adrenaline filled his body as Beatriz fell into the ocean, the cold water enveloping her. Fernando stood frozen in the boat, realizing what he had done. The darkness of the sea swallowed her, and he could barely see her struggling to get to the surface. Fernando, feeling everything falling apart, threw himself into the sea. Beatriz, he screamed, terror permeating his voice as his heart raced. He started to swim towards her, but fear had paralyzed him and he stood there, hesitating, feeling the horror and reality hit him. Beatriz, struggling to get back to the surface, felt the oxygen slipping away from her, her lungs burning as the water engulfed her. Fernando, help me, she begged. But her voice was just an echo in the dark water. The waves swirled around her, enveloping her, and she felt like she was going to lose everything. The images of their love, the shared laughter, the future they had built together were her last light. Why did I do it? Beatrice mused, as despair overcame her. It had all been a mistake, but there was no turning back now. Fernando finally reached her, but anger and pain had blinded him. When he grabbed her arm, instead of helping her, he pushed her back under the water. That was the last spark of life that Beatrice felt fading inside her. As she sank, a mixture of sadness and despair invaded her. She tried to break free and swim, but Fernando's strength was too much. "Forgive me," she whispered before the light went out. Horrified by what he had done, Fernando felt Beatrice's body being sucked into the water. The truth hit him with unbreakable force. "No, no, no," he cried, but it was too late. The wave of guilt washed over him, and the boat began to rock as darkness engulfed it. "What have I done?" he asked himself, his eyes filling with tears. The echo of her scream echoed in the distance as Fernando sank to his knees on the boat, staring into the emptiness where Beatrice had once been. Each anguished word she had uttered felt like nails in his heart, deadly and piercing. As tears streamed down his face, he realized that he had lost not only Beatrice, but his own humanity as well. He returned to the shore, pushed by the dark current that would engulf him forever. Loneliness took hold of his heart, and the echo of his own cries of despair became a mantra that he could never get out of his head. He knew that he would never be able to forgive himself for what he had done. Fernando stood on the beach, shivering, as the tide washed over him. Life around him continued on. The waves continued to crash, the city lights gleamed in the distance, but he was trapped in his desolation. The hours passed, and morning approached, silent and impartial. Fernando knew that his life would never be the same. Guilt had consumed him. His heart, once full of love, now felt like a desert. There was no redemption anymore, only an unfathomable emptiness that would accompany him in every step he took. Knowing that nothing would ever be the same again, and that now his children would ask him about their mother, and he could only answer that he would not return again, carrying this with him for the rest of his life.